profound distinction to introduce our hometown hero, General James L Dozier, retired U.S. Army officer, Vietnam War veteran, recipient of a Purple Heart and Silver Star, and that is only to name very few. The rest he will share with us this evening. General James Dozier.
Thank you, Tori. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to share an experience that I had in Italy a number of years ago. Also, thank you all for supporting the museum. We sincerely appreciate that. The way I'm going to go about that is, first of all, talk a little bit about international terrorism, because as I'll show you, it's a fact of life in many parts of the world. And I'll start by talking about that. Then I'll talk about the environment in which some of us were serving back in the 1970s and early 80s in Europe. As I'll show you, it was during the Cold War, and there were just an awful lot of things going on vis-a-vis the Warsaw Pact and NATO. Then I'll talk you through the experience from my standpoint, and then we'll leave plenty of time for questions. But before I do that, I've spent a lot of time in Texas. And one of the things you learn when you talk to a Texas audience is find out who you're talking to. Are there any Aggies in here? You're by yourself? How about Marines? You're double dipped. Well, the reason I ask is if you're going to tell a joke, and there are people like that in the audience, then first of all, you tell them you're going to tell a joke. Then you speak very, very slowly. And you don't use too many big words. And then tell them that when it comes to the punchline, if you don't understand that, just punch the person next to you, as long as he's not an Aggie or a Marine or one of those folks, and he'll explain it to you. Here it comes. Not too long ago, a bunch of Marines challenged some Air Force guys to an ice fishing contest in Alaska. They were on a winter exercise up there, and they got their teams all set up, and Marines went down to one end of this frozen pond, and the Air Force went down to the other end, and they started fishing. Pretty soon the Marines looked down there, and the Air Force guys were pulling fish out of that ice like you couldn't imagine. But the Marines weren't catching anything. So the sergeant, team leader, he decided he better send somebody down to check it out. So he sent a scout down there, and the scout came running back and said, Sarge, he said, those Air Force guys are cheating. And he said, what do you mean cheating? And he said, they cut a hole in the ice. Now wait a minute. That's not the end of it. You know, the Marines don't like to come in second best on anything. So they decided they'd better practice. So they found another frozen pond, and they remembered the first rule of ice fishing, and they started chopping. Pretty soon a voice from above thunders down and says, there are no fish under that ice. And the Marines looked up there and went right back to chopping. Pretty soon the voice thundered down again and said, there are no fish under that ice. And one of the Marines looked up and said, is that you, God? And the voice came back and said, no, I'm the ice rink manager. Okay. Here we go. A little bit about international terrorism. It's a fact of life in many parts of the world. There's no standard definition of terrorism. It's one of those things that you know when you see it or when you experience it. There are a whole lot of people in the business, religious folks, political folks, neither the right nor the left has a monopoly on it. This is what they're trying to do one way or the other. They're trying to destabilize the different institutions that keep a country going. This is where we fit into it, simply because of who we are and what we do, and particularly the leadership role that we exercise in most parts of the world. We represent a threat to what these terrorist organizations are trying to do, and because we represent a threat to them, they single us out for special attention. But when you back off and think about that for just a second, you know, that's something that we can really be proud of, and most of us are. I was kidnapped for a very special reason. Remember, this was 1981. It was during the Cold War. The Soviet Union hadn't collapsed yet. Russia decided to to install SS-20 missiles into the Eastern Bloc. The Warsaw Pact consisted of Eastern Europe, and then NATO was Western Europe. So NATO wanted to counter this, and they decided to install cruise missiles in Belgium and Sicily. This really stirred up the left-wing organizations on the continent. And the Red Brigades decided that they would try to topple the Italian government in an effort to preclude the installation of the cruise missiles in Italy. And they put together a campaign called the Winter of Fire. It was a very sophisticated campaign. It involved kidnappings, killings, and in addition, they had plans to shoot down civilian airliners at the municipal airports. It was a well-designed, pretty well orchestrated campaign. But as I will explain, what the Italians did in the wake of my rescue put the Red Brigades out of business and completely forestalled their plans to get Italy out of NATO and stop the cruise missile installation in Italy. So with that as background, I'll go through a couple of slides here that will give you an idea of the threat environment that most of us were subjected to in Europe at that time. First of all, I was assigned to a NATO headquarters called Land South in Verona, Italy, up in the northern part of Italy. Verona is a very lovely town in the southern foothills of the Alps, and from the roof of our apartment building, we could see some of the snow-capped Alps. Very historic place. It's a setting for Romeo and Juliet. The headquarters that I was assigned to was a NATO headquarters called Land South. It was the land component of the Southern Command of NATO at that time. And the headquarters for the Southern Command of NATO was in Naples, Italy. This is Juliet's balcony, one of the tourist attractions there in Verona. This is Juliet's statue. This is a Roman Colosseum in which outdoor performances were held without any electronic assistance. The stage was set up so the acoustics were just perfect. The stage was set up so that those on the opposite side of the arena could hear exactly what was going on without amplification. Is there anybody here who has been in Verona? Well, you know that it is a very lovely town, very, very historic. With that as background, again, the threat environment that we were subjected to, the Cold War was in full swing. Left-wing organizations on the continent were running amok, and they targeted NATO in general and Americans in particular. One of the opening salvos was fired by a group in Germany in the early 1970s called the Baader-Meinhof Gang. It later became the Red Army faction, a very militant left-wing terrorist organization. and you can see what they did there. But fast forward to 1981, that same group, now the Red Army faction, set off bombs in front of the Air Force headquarters at Ramstein Air Force Base. The bombs were designed as butane cylinders on the back of a camper. A little bit later, that same group, the RAF, fired rocket-propelled grenades at a sedan carrying General Croson and his wife as they went to work in downtown Heidelberg one morning. Fortunately, they escaped serious injury. A little bit later, down in Italy, I was kidnapped. Still later, in January of 1982, people we now know to be the Lebanese Armed Revolutionary Front killed Lieutenant Colonel Ray, our assistant army attaché in Paris. Rhein-Main Air Force Base, where my daughter was stationed at the time, was a particular target of the RAF. And they bombed the officers' club, they bombed the base headquarters, the railroad, and you can see some of the damage as this high point of activity continued into 1985. To get into the specifics of the kidnapping, this is the apartment building that my wife and I lived in Verona. We occupied the top floor front apartment. By no stretch of the imagination could, from a housing standpoint, could this be called a hardship to them, because this was a very lovely apartment. We also occupied the penthouse, and when we were up there on the roof, you could see the southern foothills of the Alps and the snow-capped Alps themselves. I had come home early on the evening of 17 December in order to get ready for a community council meeting. My wife and I were having a drink in the kitchen when the doorbell on our floor rang. Now this was unusual, because in a building such as this, there are two doorbell systems. One can be operated from the street, and this is a picture of ours. This lets somebody in the building talk to whoever wants to get in the building on an intercom. You can either open the front door electrically or tell them to go away. This is not the doorbell that had rung, and my wife was a little bit concerned about that. I told her, don't worry about it, sort of famous last words. And I went to the front door, I asked who was there. The word came back that we're plumbers, that there's a leak in the apartment downstairs. We'd like to check yours to see if that's where the water's coming from. It sounded reasonable to me, because the building was about 20 years old and things were always going wrong with it. So I opened the front door. Well, first of all, a schematic of the apartment. This is the front door right here. There's a lateral hallway which ran the width of the building, about 80 feet wide. A kitchen, a washroom, a utility room. Then down on the other end, a den. This is the area in the apartment where most of the activity is about to take place. So I opened the front door in the left picture here, and there stood two young men. They looked like plumbers, they acted like plumbers, so I let them in. We walked off down the hallway, this hallway right here. The light that you see coming from the right is from our kitchen. Further down the hallway, still on the right, is the washroom and utility room. We walked down that hallway. I figured that the washroom was the most likely source of the leaks. So we checked that out for leaks, couldn't find any. Then one of the two young men used a word in Italian that I didn't understand. So I told him we need to go back to the kitchen. I have an Italian-English dictionary there. I'll look up the word and I'll see what you're talking about. Back in the kitchen, when we got back to the kitchen, my wife was fixing dinner in front of this cupboard right here. I was bending over this table to the left, looking up the word in the dictionary, and that's when the fun began. I was jumped from the rear, spun around, and I was looking down the barrels of two silenced pistols. A fight started, which I very quickly began to lose. And during that, the big guy was the one who jumped me. There was a big guy and a little guy. the little guy slipped past the two of us who were wrestling around and grabbed my wife. Pretty soon, I was hit on the head, and I ended up on my back in the hallway outside of the kitchen. And when I looked back into the kitchen, the guy who'd rushed past me had my wife on her knees with a pistol pointed at her head. And that's when the fight was over. I was handcuffed, blindfolded, and gagged. And then as I was further immobilized and my wife immobilized, they let two other individuals into the apartment who began to ransack it. This is a picture of our den. It's pretty messed up. As you can see, they took pretty much whatever they want. But what probably caused me more grief than anything else associated with this experience is that over here in the corner, I kept a lot of my personal files in manila folders. And included in those files were my income tax backup papers from 1981. You know, when you're overseas, you try to do the right thing, turn your income tax in on time. I'd collected all these papers, and I'll talk more about this a little bit later, but it probably caused me more grief than anything else because I lost my income tax backup papers. Then they brought this trunk into the apartment. Notice that it's padded on the inside, but from my standpoint, it had one major design flaw, and that is no air holes. And when you're inside of that thing and they close the lid, that presented a problem. I was loaded into the trunk and taken outside of the apartment. This is the elevator that I was about to be loaded into. These steps go up to the roof of the building, and I'll come back to them a little bit later. The trunk with me in it was taken downstairs into a courtyard behind the apartment building and loaded into the back of a Fiat hatchback. I was then driven across this bridge right here into this part of town and into the basement parking garage of another high-rise apartment building. I mentioned that Verona's a lovely town. This picture was taken from the balcony of our apartment, and we used to enjoy sitting out there at night looking out at the lights of this old European city. Then I was driven for about an hour and a half to Padova, another lovely town up in northeastern Italy. And this map shows what happened next. There's our apartment, the bridge in the picture. After we went into the basement parking garage of that other high-rise apartment building, the box was taken out of the Fiat van and loaded into the back of a Fiat hatchback. Then the van was abandoned in another part of town. I was driven for about an hour and a half and ended up in another high-rise apartment building in Padova, specifically in the second floor apartment that overlooked this supermarket that you see here. This is the apartment. The box was put in the building elevator, run up and down a couple of times to disorient me, and then we stopped on the second floor, and this is the landing on the second floor, and this is the door to the apartment I'm about to go into. Elevator here, door here. I was taken inside and dumped into the left-hand portion of this tent arrangement in an area that was about 6 feet by 6 feet. The type of tent that they used, I'll show you a photo of it in a minute. You see on a lot of beaches in Europe. It's a cabana type tent. I was chained to the bunk by one arm and one leg. A guard would sit in a chair out here 24 hours a day. 4 men and 1 woman rotated guard duty. They had an alarm button they would use to call each other from time to time. This is a picture of the tent itself taken from the outside looking through the guards compartment, and this technique of housing a kidnapped victim in a tent inside of a structure was first used by Argentinian terrorists back in the early 1970s. And it's designed to do a couple of things. First of all, it allows the guards to completely control the environment in which they keep a prisoner. None of your senses can penetrate outside of that small area that you're being held in. The second thing, though, it's designed to do is to preclude the onset of the Stockholm Syndrome. That's the syndrome associated with a relationship that sometimes develops between guards and prisoners who are kept in close proximity to each other for extended periods. Patty Hearst is a good example of that. It had no effect on me, but it did have an effect on one of the guards, which worked to my benefit at the time that I was rescued. As I mentioned, I was chained to the bunk by an arm and a leg, and they never completely unhooked me from that bunk. There was a porta potty in there, and they would bring me toothbrush and toothpaste. My sanitary conditions were pretty good. You can see one of the chains right here wrapped in tape that was used to keep me hooked to the bunk. In this picture here, you can see some playing cards on the floor. I asked for and was given early on playing cards, reading material. The reading material consisted of the international editions of Time and Newsweek, also some Italian news magazines and English language novels. The Time and Newsweek magazines that they would give me were censored. They would tear out the articles that dealt with my being kidnapped, but they would forget to tear out the index, so the table of contents. So I would read these magazines and I'd see the index, table of contents say, massive manhunt going on in Italy. And I figured that was I was probably involved in that. For what it's worth, I was reading 1984 at the time that I was rescued. And if you're ever in jail and you need something uplifting to read, 1984 ain't it. But by that time, I would have read almost anything. I was rescued after 6 weeks as a result of just good, solid police work on the part of the Italian authorities with help from our Special Operations Forces. For about 4 weeks into the 6 weeks, the Italians had run out of leads. So they went back through the prisons and started reinterrogating the folks that they'd already picked up. Also, our special operations guys ginned up an operation in support of the Italians. The Italians finally found the brother of a small-time terrorist, but a big-time narcotics dealer who knew where the driver was that drove me from Verona to Padova. And they found him in bed with his girlfriend, and they interrogated him within earshot on opposite ends of a hallway. And pretty soon they were telling him things they didn't even want to know. But then they had to make sure that I was still there where he dropped me off. And that's where our special operators came in. They were able to determine that I was still in the building. And as a result, then the National Police SWAT team, the NOCS, the NOCS, ginned up the operation that rescued me. And the way they went about that is, first of all, they broke their team, and I'll show you pictures of this team in a little bit. They broke the team up into sub-elements. One element secured threw a ring of security around the building that I was in. Another element secured the floor that I was on. another element worked with the local authorities to create a distraction out in the parking lot in front of that supermarket. They learned that my guards always watched what was going on in the parking lot. So what the guards saw that morning was a lowboy pull into the parking lot and unload a backhoe. Also an air compressor and a jackhammer. And they started digging up the parking lot. The guards watched this for a while, and pretty soon another vehicle pulled up, and out of the back of it, a couple of guys got out wearing tight-fitting coats, ski masks, carrying submachine guns, and went into the supermarket. At first, my guards thought that, well, this is just a way that the guys are making payroll this week. They're going to rob the supermarket, and that is the way they would finance some of their operations. But as more security showed up, it was apparent a rescue attempt was underway, and in that process, fortunately for me, the guards decided not to resist. They took advantage of a law that the Italians had at that time called the penitence law. The penitence law said that if you're a convicted terrorist and you cooperate with the authorities, whatever sentence you get will automatically be cut in half. So of the 5 people that were picked up by the police, and I'll show you pictures of them, they all took advantage of the penitence law and decided to help the authorities. My first indication that something unusual was going on when I was sitting on the bunk reading 1984 for the second time. I looked out under the flap of the tent, and the walls of the tent billowed, which meant somebody was creating air currents to billow the walls of the tent. And I saw an arm reach through the outer flap of the tent and hand my guard a pistol. This was unusual because the guards were never armed. But almost immediately, another figure burst through the outer flap of the tent and knocked the guard down. The guard got up, and they knocked him down again. And pretty soon, the commander of the rescue unit came in and stopped that fight because they thought they were going to kill the guard. But at any rate, then they pushed the guy that knocked him down, pushed his way into my part of the tent, and sort of naively, I began pushing him out because I wasn't quite sure just what was going on. I knew that the Red Brigades were not a homogeneous operation, and I thought maybe this was a rival element within the Red Brigades that wanted to horn in on the kidnapping. But finally the guy took his ski mask off and told me that he was a policeman, and I believed him for the first time in a couple of minutes. Then he said, we got to get you out of here because we understand that the building is rigged for demolition. As I'll show you, there's a lot of arms and ammunition in that apartment, but fortunately none of it was set. Then began for me, and I'm not being facetious when I tell you this, probably the most exciting part of this whole experience, and that was a ride downtown in the back of an Italian police car during the noon rush hour through the crowded streets of this old European city. This map shows what happened next. The so-called People's Prison here. We took off. The lights were flashing, the sirens were going, people and vehicles were parting like the Red Sea as we made our way uptown. I looked at the speedometer one time, and we were doing 140 kilometers an hour downtown, on the sidewalk, off the sidewalk. Italians in general, I think, are pretty good drivers, but I think the ones that you see are the survivors. The rest of them just didn't make it. Their idea of driving an automobile, whether it's on the autostrada or downtown, is keep that engine turning at 4,000 or 5,000 RPM and control the motion of it with the clutch and the brake. And that's what we did. The roads, the streets are not nearly as wide as they appear on this map, and they darn sure aren't as straight. We finally made it to the city hall. I'm the guy in the white coat, and I was glad to get there for more than just one reason. That was just about all the excitement that you needed on a Thursday morning. upstairs into the chief's office. That's the guy with the telephone there. Excuse me. Sort of naively, when I got into the chief's office the first time, I asked him personally, which was a big mistake, to try to get my headquarters on the phone so I could report back in. Well, he turned to his secretary and she was gone. Somebody had sent her for coffee. And this poor guy was so new in the job up there in northeastern Italy that he didn't understand the long-distance telephone system. So he was stuck until he could get some help with a long-distance call. So what you see is the result of about a 10-minute goat rope. He's smiling for about the first time, and I'm about to report back in. I show this picture here for a couple of reasons. One, that's the cup of coffee that caused all the problems with the telephone call, but also the clothes that I have on were provided by the Red Brigade, and I still have them. In addition to all the things that the police found in that apartment in Padova was the expense account that the Red Brigades had been keeping. And one of the line items in the expense account was the Italian equivalent of about $50 US for a uniform for the prisoner. Well, I still have that warm-up suit, and there's a little price tag in the collar that says that the real price was about $14. And yep, it turned out they were ripping off their higher headquarters over in Milan. And if there's a moral associated with this, it's the fact that in all of these terrorist organizations, there's usually a hard core, but there are also fringe elements, most of whom are common criminals. And at least somebody in this group of 5 couldn't resist the opportunity to make a lira or two off of what he or she was doing. Here's some pictures taken inside of the apartment. The guard's chair. This is I should have said I was generally well treated, but I should have qualified that and said, except for the fact that I had to wear earphones through which recorded music was played almost continuously. It started out with acid rock. You know, if you listen to that stuff long enough and it's loud enough, it's going to get you. I have a hearing impairment now, partially because of that, but mainly because when I was on active duty, I didn't behave myself around helicopters or tank guns and stuff like that. So thank goodness the VA has provided me hearing aids. This is the silenced pistol that was handed to the guard at the time they broke in there. It's also the type of silenced pistol that was used by the kidnapping team back in Verona. I mentioned that there was a lot of arms and ammunition found in the apartment. The place was a veritable arsenal. A lot of weapons. These silencers you see here, I showed this picture up at the Special Operations School one time, and I mentioned that the silencers were provided to European terrorist organizations by Libya, which is true. One of the guys at the Special Operations School said, though, I think you ought to know that all of them were made in the United States, and somehow the Libyans got a hold of them. As you can see, they got their fair share. Automatic weapons, a lot of explosives. I could smell them working with C4 from time to time, and as they went about some of their other activities. The C4 has a very distinctive smell, and you know it's around. Other pictures taken inside, they had a nice photo capability. Not the best housekeepers in the world. You can see weapons on the bed lying around here. This is the mimeograph machine they would use to print their different memos and releases to the media. This is one of their products from the photo lab. A little story goes along with this. they came in one day and said, "We want to take your picture, and we want you to hold this sign." And I told them, "No, I don't want to hold that sign." And they said, "Well, it doesn't make any difference. If you don't hold it, we'll just pin it to your shirt." So I decided, this might be a way to get word to the outside world. So the first way I tried to hold the sign was with my fingers in a V, and they said, "No, that won't work." So then I tried to do this, and they said, "No, that won't work either." So they very carefully placed my fingers on the edges of the sign, but in one of the pictures that was released in one of their communiques, it had not been adequately cropped, and it showed my military academy class ring. And my wife picked up on that right away, and that was the first real indication that folks knew that I was still alive. They took another picture just before I was rescued, and by that time I had a beard, and it was another indication that I was still alive. This is their kitchen. I got a good look at that on the way out. It's just as well I didn't get a look at it on the way in. It would not have passed any inspection by any of the military services, even the Marine Corps. So, these are the 5 individuals who were picked up by the police at the time that I was rescued. A little bit about them. All were in their mid-20s. The leader of the group is this guy right here, Sebastian. At this time, he was 26 years old, but also by this time, he'd been involved in 17 murders, to include that of Aldo Moro, a very prominent Italian politician who was done in by this same bunch. This is the guard on duty at the time that I was rescued. Fortunately for me, he was affected somewhat by the Stockholm Syndrome. This young lady here is the daughter of a very prominent Italian doctor who kept his yacht moored at Venice, not too far from Padua. And from time to time, she would take the yacht out into the Adriatic and bring in arms supply vessels that would come in from Lebanon and Syria and bring them ashore in Italy. This gal here is the one who recruited this guy into the Red Brigades. These 4 cooperated with the authorities, and as a result led the authorities to the arrest of over 100 key members of the Red Brigades, and also the discovery of arms caches all over Italy, most of which contained surface-to-air missiles. All told, their cooperation with the police resulted in about 1,000 members of the Red Brigades being picked up and effectively breaking the Red Brigade's back. The other guy, and all those 4 are out on work release programs now. The only guy still in jail is this guy right here. He has a bad habit of spitting on his jailers, and as long as he keeps spitting, they keep him around. He's sort of a hardcore guy, and our last trip to Italy, when was that, October? We found out he was still in jail. I mentioned that I had this income tax problem. They had taken my income tax backup papers, and by the way, I never got the originals back. They gave me copies of them. But after I was rescued, I got a telephone call while I was getting shaved from the President of the United States. And he asked if I could come back the following week to the National Prayer Breakfast. And I made the mistake of telling him no. I'd been out of the loop for about 6 weeks, and there are a whole bunch of things I needed to get caught up on. Well, about 30 minutes later, I got a call from the Chief of Staff of the Army's office, and they say, "We have booked you on an airplane, and you're coming back to Washington." Well, I was invited to the White House, and this was February. and income tax time was fast approaching. So I was starting to worry about my income tax, so I thought, boy, you know, if you have a problem and you got this opportunity, go right to the top. So I mentioned it to President Reagan, and he just looked at me and smiled and said, good luck. So when you talk about terrorist organizations, you got to put these IRS guys right in there with some of the best of them. And as you know from the news, they really haven't changed since. I also mentioned that we try to go back to Italy every year and thank the guys who rescued me. And we really enjoy doing that. We've gotten to know these folks, and they're just super people. This is a picture of the rescue gang taken last year. The leader of the group is this guy right here. The leader of the team that came into the apartment is this little guy right here. He's sort of a Casper milquetoast, but he would slit your throat in a heartbeat if he had the opportunity. He is a poet now and also a farmer. All these guys have retired. The guy that broke the door down is this guy right here. The way they went about getting into the apartment, they loaded that guy on the left up with two 40-pound flak vests and backed him off about 10 feet and aimed him towards the door. And he hit the door, it went down. Then he got upset because other members of the team stepped on him and said, let's get into the apartment. So he tells that story every time we come back. Oops. I have had occasion to meet with some of the members of the Red Brigade. The guy on the left is one of the planners of the operation of my kidnapping. We met several years ago, and we shook hands and called it a day. The lady in the center is our contact in Italy. She is a super lady and she speaks both fluent English and Italian, and she has been our point of contact for many, many years, and she arranges these get-togethers with the rescuers. That's it. I'll be glad to answer any questions that you might have. I've just hit the high points, so there's a lot of other stuff that we could touch on depending on what your interest might be. Yes, ma'am.
I think you should tell them what happened to Judy, your wife, when they chained her and she was gagged and so on, and they took you off in the box.
My wife at that time died a number of years ago, and Charlene's husband died a number of years ago. As a result, we have an arranged marriage. One of our mutual friends decided we'd been single long enough, so she had a dinner party and invited both of us, and then bugged us until we started seeing each other. So Charlene is not the gal in the apartment in Verona. But they left my wife tied up in the apartment, and once she figured out that they had really left, they had put her in that washroom down at the end of the hall. But they had chained her arms behind her back and chained her ankles, and they ran a chain between the wrist chains around her arms and the ankle chains. So somebody told Judy that, Judy, you were hogtied. So, but anyhow, she can attest that hogs don't go very far. But while she was in the washroom, she found out that the chains were held together by little locks. And the locks, the little padlocks, had keys left in them. So she figured that they wanted her to get loose at some point, but not right away. So she fiddled around with the locks The first lock that she fiddled with, the key didn't work. Turns out later they left the wrong key in that lock. Then she fiddled with another one and was able to release it, and it released the chains between her wrist chains behind her back and then the ankle chains. And she was able to squirm around then, and then she saw the pilot light in the water heater in the washroom. Then she knew where she was. So she went over to the washing machine and started banging her knees and body against the washing machine, hoping that the people downstairs would pay attention. About 5:30 in the afternoon or 6 o'clock is quiet hour in Italian apartments. So she figured that if she could make enough noise, somebody would get upset about it. And sure enough, they heard her, but they were about to watch a TV special. So the people downstairs went to the other end of their apartment and watched the special and came back about an hour later, and the noise was still going on. So then they contacted some of our friends in the apartment, who went up on the roof and broke in through a bathroom window and came down and found Judy in the washroom. And that they, of course, had called the police by that time, and they had the bolt cutters and they cut the chains. So from that point on, Judy and the world's media were pretty good buddies, because they had no access to me, but they had access to the family. The military was real good about uniting our family. Our son was in college up in North Florida, and they put him on an airplane and flew him under an assumed name to Italy. Our daughter was stationed at Rhine-Main there in Germany. She was a lieutenant at that time. And they put her on the medevac flight and got her down to be with her mom very quickly. So the family was reunited. The government gave Judy as much support as she could possibly imagine. Our embassy went into overdrive. The Italian government went into overdrive. And it was really one of those things that makes you proud, not only to be an American, but to be a member of the armed forces, because they rallied around and supported the family. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Why is it that high-value targets such as the Brigadier General in Italy didn't have a security contingent to protect you and your family?
Quite frankly, we didn't think that we were that the threat was directed at us, and we were negligent. I had access to as much intel as I could possibly stand. Not only the Italian police reports, but also the NATO intelligence reports, and also the code word stuff that was provided by the government. But we just flat underestimated the threat. Later on, after I was rescued, they fortified that apartment, put all sorts of devices into it, and at one point the Italians started calling it the bunker. So we got the word, and we reacted, but we made a mistake. A little tidbit with regard to that, most of the activity was going on up in West Germany, and in France and Netherlands and in Greece. And after I was rescued, some of the generals up in Germany began carrying submachine guns to work. And General Crozen didn't think that was very wise. He had visions of his generals getting involved in a shootout on a city street. And what he told them was, is we'll provide you security, put the weapons down. They didn't. So he invited General McFadden, who was the CTAF commander, and me up to talk to his generals. And there were 19 of them in the room at that time. and we went through our talk about the security, how we handle security in Italy, and he made every one of those generals stand up. General so-and-so, do you understand? General so-and-so, do you understand? And he went right around the room, and they turned their submachine guns in. It just doesn't pay. Let the security guys do what they're trained to do, and they'll do a hell of a lot better job at it. Yes, ma'am.
I think you should tell everyone about your book. I mean, that there's a book, because it's amazing.
Do what now?
About your book. Let everyone know that you have a book out, because
Oh,
it's very, very good.
I had a book written about me. Ralph, could you hold that thing up? It's called Winter of Fire. It's about 85% accurate. I'm writing, you can find it here in the museum after Ralph gets to reading it. I am writing one, but I'm not very fast with the typing. My target date is sometime this summer. Amy.
General Dozier, did you think you would be rescued? What did you, when you were held captive, did you think you would be rescued? What did you think was going to happen?
A good question. The question was, did I think I was going to be rescued, or how did I think the thing would end? When I met with a member of the Red Brigade, I asked him that very same question. And he said it all depended upon the cruise missiles, what Italy did with the cruise missiles. So the chances are, if NATO had insisted on the cruise missiles being installed in Sicily, then I wouldn't be here. But that's the part of the business.
My other question is, did he apologize when you met him? When you met the guy who planned all of this, did he apologize?
No. And I didn't apologize to him either. He is now a youth counselor and is working with young folks and doing a very effective job of it. He asked that we not tell the Italians what he was doing with the Red Brigades because he thought he would get fired. So he is leading a productive life now. He served his time in jail. It was about 30 years worth.
Can you tell his name?
Pardon?
Can you say his name?
I'd rather not.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah, I understand. I just wondered if he's one of those I read about in the book. So it's fine.
His name is not in the book.
Okay. Thank
There's
you.
a question back here. Yes.
This is two questions I have for you, General.
I'm hard of hearing, so
Yeah, okay. Two questions. The first question is, when you were transported in that box, did you do any kind of breathing techniques? Did you mentally calm yourself down? Were you trained in that situation? The second question is, how did you relate to the captor, where you established a relationship with the Stockholm syndrome with that one captor? What did you do to establish that relationship?
okay. The first question is yes, you can control your breathing. If you can reduce your heart rate and try to be as calm as possible, your oxygen requirements aren't as high as they are when you're excited. So I made a conscious effort to do that. But what they would do is while the car was going through a town, they would close the lid of the trunk. But then as soon as we'd clear the town, they'd check my pulse and my breathing to make sure that I was alive. The most unpleasant thing, other than the breathing, was the fact that I had handcuffs on, and every time I rolled a certain way, those things would tighten up. And for a number of months after that, I lost feeling in my left hand. With regard to my relationship with the guys who were the guards, I was put on trial in a people's court. The objective of the trial was to show the Italian people what war criminals Americans were. And I rued the day that we inflated our award citations from Vietnam and other wars, because they used these as prima facie evidence that I was a war criminal. But I told them right up front that we're not going to talk about anything top secret, and they said, we don't want to know anything about anything top secret. We just want the Italian people to know what war criminals that you Americans are. So that was pretty much the way it was. A court session would be me sitting on the bunk and Savasta reading questions from a rule pad. They were translating stuff that they had found in my apartment. I kept nothing classified in the apartment, but they used a lot of that stuff. They found my award citations, and of course, they questioned me on that. At one point, they tried to brainwash me. The guy who is still in jail is sort of their political theoretician. He came in one day and gave me a 12-page, double-spaced, typewritten treatise on the Red Brigades on legal paper. And he said, read this. So I skimmed it and threw it under the bunk. He came in a couple of days later and gave me a quiz on it, and I flunked. So for about a week, we sat down with an Italian-English dictionary, and we translated that thing word for word. I would look at him, I'd read some part of it that was just screwy, and ask him if he really believed that stuff. And it was insulting to him. He genuinely wanted me to see things his way. At one point, they said, we want you to tell the Italian people what the overall U.S. plan is for the subjugation of Italy, politically, militarily, and economically. And I told him, you just got the wrong boy, because first of all, there is no such plan. And secondly, if there were such a plan, at the level I work, I wouldn't be privy to it. And they said, oh yeah, you Americans have done that before. So I asked them when, and they used the Marshall Plan as an example. They said, if we can't convert you, maybe we can at least make you neutral. They did not use any brute force on me other than that recorded music, which was bad enough.
You don't like hard rock?
No, but after a while though, I would argue with the guards, and they'd turn the volume down. And after a while, but the next guard came on duty, he'd turn it back up. I finally got him to change it to Gershwin, and I think I know almost everything that Gershwin ever wrote. Yes, sir.
What was your role in the prayer breakfast, and did you ever have any other interactions with President Reagan?
I'm sorry.
Your role in the prayer breakfast and any future interactions with the President?
I did go to the prayer breakfast with the President, and the prayer breakfast was held in the hotel whose entrance was where he got shot. And of course he went out a side door, and the guy was waiting out there to shoot him. He said, you know, when you get shot, it really hurts like hell. But that was the first time. A little bit later, we were invited back to the White House to meet the president of Italy, who was there on a state visit. And we had another meeting with the president. I sat at the president's table with Thurgood Marshall, who was on the Supreme Court, and President Reagan, and other dignitaries, the president of Italy. They used that as an excuse to get me transferred back to the United States. our government decided that I should finish my tour, and I agreed with that. But the Italians wanted me out of the country. Since it was their country, they got the last vote. So they used the state visit by the president of Italy to get me out of the country. Mysteriously, packers came as soon as I got that invitation and started packing up our household goods, and the rest is history. Well, I want to thank you all for supporting the museum, and Missy, you're a nickel now.
Thank you so much. You know, this it was everything I had hoped. So educational, but I feel compelled. Anybody that wants to stand and face a flag, I feel compelled to do the Pledge of Allegiance right now. Pick one. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic